They came earlier than I expected. I wasn't sleeping, of course. No one sleeps the night before their own death, but the sound of the metal lock striking the cell door still made me jump. It was a dry, final sound that echoed down the silent corridor. It wasn't the usual banging of the changing of the guard or the food bowl being kicked across the floor. It was a sound of purpose. "Get up!" the voice shouted from the other side, muffled by the thick metal. I didn't even need him to say my name. I knew it was for me. I felt it in my stomach, a cold knot that had formed there weeks ago and was now tightening with full force. My whole body felt like it was full of wet sand. Every movement was a monumental effort. Trying to get up from the dirty straw mat was like trying to lift a stone. The air in the cell was rancid, a familiar smell of mold, old sweat, and the bucket in the corner. But that morning, it seemed 1,000 times stronger, as if it were trying to suffocate me before they even had the chance. The soldier who opened the door was a face I didn't recognize, which somehow made it all worse. The usual guards, at least, I knew how they looked, some with hatred, others with a cruel boredom. This new one had empty, impersonal eyes. He didn't see me as a man. I was just a task to be completed before the sun got too hot. He gripped my arm with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into my skin, and I stumbled out into the dimly lit corridor. The cold of the stone floor instantly shot up through my bare feet, a sharp sensation that reminded me I was still alive, that my body could still feel the ground. They didn't tie my hands immediately. The soldier just pushed me forward, his hand still on my arm, guiding me through corridors I already knew. But that now seemed completely different. It was like walking through a bad dream. The silence was what got to me the most. Normally, this place teemed with coughs, whispers, the dragging of chains. But now, nothing. I could hear my own bare feet on the floor, a wet, dragging sound. When we passed the main block, I saw the faces, the other prisoners. They were standing, clutching the bars of their cells, just watching. No one said a word. Their eyes followed me, and I couldn't read what was in them. Pity? Fear? Maybe relief it wasn't them. An older man, whom I knew from sharing a piece of bread with me 2 weeks before, simply lowered his head when I looked at him. That gesture, that small movement of resignation, almost broke the fog I was in. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want anything. I just wanted my knees to stop shaking so much. Then we reached the archway leading to the courtyard. The morning sunlight hit me like a physical wall. It was so bright, so painfully white, that I had to close my eyes. I had been used to the gloom of the cell for weeks, and this open light felt like an assault. The soldier pushed me forward harder, into the brightness. When my eyes adjusted, I saw it. It was there, in the center of the packed dirt courtyard. A dark wooden post. It wasn't straight. It was slightly tilted to the left, as if it were tired of standing. The wood was cracked by the sun and time, and I could see darker stains on it, especially around chest and waist height. I tried not to think about what those stains were, but my brain wouldn't obey. My stomach churned violently. Thick, frayed ropes hung from it, looking like dead snakes. It was the most horrifying and, at the same time, most mundane sight I had ever had. It was just a piece of wood. But it was the piece of wood that would end my life. Behind it, I could hear the murmuring. I didn't turn to look, but I knew there was a crowd. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, a physical pressure on my back. Were they people from the city? Other soldiers? It didn't matter. They were there to watch. The soldier who brought me handed me over to 2 others who grabbed me by the arms. They were not gentle. They dragged me the last few meters and shoved me against the wood. The smell was dust and something vaguely metallic, like old blood dried in the sun. The wood was warm from the morning sun, a warmth that seemed to mock the cold inside me. The process of tying me was brutal and efficient. They wasted no time. One of them pulled my arms back, crossing my wrists against the post. The rope he used was rough, full of splinters, and I felt it bite into my skin instantly. He pulled the knot with a jerk that made my shoulders pop. It wasn't just to hold me. It was to hurt. It was meant to humiliate me. I could feel the guard's hot breath and the smell of sour sweat as he worked. He was breathing heavily, as if doing hard labor. Then came the rope for my waist. They circled me several times, pressing me so hard against the wood that I could barely breathe. Each wrap of the rope expelled a little more air from my lungs. I was trapped, completely immobilized. There was nothing more I could do. A strange kind of calm, an emptiness, began to take over me. It wasn't peace. It was resignation. My brain seemed to be shutting down, as if protecting itself from what was to come. I could hear the commander shouting something in the distance, but the words made no sense. They were just sounds, like the buzzing of an insect. I looked forward, at the brick wall on the other side of the courtyard, and tried to focus on the texture of the mortar between the bricks. Anything but what was happening to me. The commander's voice finally cut through the fog in my mind. He wasn't shouting orders at me, but at the men lining up in front of me. There were 6 of them. I hadn't noticed them getting into position. My focus was so fixed on the post, the rope, the wall. But now they were there, a jagged line of dusty uniforms against the glare of the sun. I could hear the sound that changed everything, the sound that made it all irrevocably real. The dry metallic click of rifles being loaded. Clack, click, clack, click, 6 times. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life, louder than any scream, any slamming cell door. It was the sound of death being prepared, a machine being armed to take me apart. My mouth was so dry it felt full of cotton and dust. I tried to swallow, but there was nothing to swallow. My jaw was locked. The heart in my chest wasn't beating with fear. It was beating with rage, as if it were trying to break my ribs and escape on its own. I could feel sweat running down my temples, but the rest of my skin was cold, clammy, despite the heat of the sun cooking my back and the wood I was pressed against. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I had to watch this. I looked at their faces, the 6 men. They didn't look like monsters. They looked tired. One of them, the youngest, on the far right, had a nervous twitch in his eye. He was blinking too fast, and his hands seemed to tremble slightly as he held his weapon. Another looked bored, chewing something slowly. They were just men. Men who were going to kill me in a few seconds because someone told them to. The commander was beside them now, with a piece of paper in his hand. He began to read. I couldn't understand the words, the official language of the accusation, but I knew what they meant. Enemy, conspiracy, illegal faith. The words floated on the hot courtyard air, but they didn't reach me. I was somewhere else. I was watching a movie of myself. I could see my own legs shaking uncontrollably. I could feel the rope cutting into my wrists every time I trembled. The sun was directly overhead now, burning my scalp, making my eyes water. I refused to blink. I didn't want the last thing I saw to be the darkness inside my own eyelids. I wanted to see the sky, but from that angle, all I saw were the men and the wall. Then, the reading stopped. The commander folded the paper methodically and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at me, just for a second. His eyes were like stones. No hatred, no compassion, just the emptiness of a job being done. That look was what finally broke me inside. All the strength, all the numbness, it all unraveled. Pure terror, like ice water, flooded my chest. I didn't want to die. My God, I didn't want to die. I tried to pray. I opened my mouth, but only a dry hiss came out. The words were stuck in my throat, choked by panic. So I prayed in my head. Jesus, I thought. Jesus, if you are here, don't leave me. Don't leave me now. I'm scared. I thought of the Bible they had found, the reason for all of this, the worn pages hidden under a loose floorboard in my house. I thought of the faces of the 7 or 8 people who met with me, their eyes shining in the candlelight as we read. Had I endangered them? Had my faith just been pride? "Forgive me," I screamed inside my mind. "Please, receive me." I shut my eyes tightly, waiting for the commander's shout, waiting for the sound of the shots that would tear my body apart. The commander shouted. I heard the beginning of the order, the ready, and then nothing. The silence was so sudden and so absolute that it was more shocking than the sound of the shots would have been. It wasn't a normal silence, not just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, thick silence, as if someone had thrown a thick blanket over the entire world. My heart stopped beating. I swear, it stopped. The air in my lungs froze. I opened my eyes, and everything was still. The commander had his hand raised in the air, in the middle of the gesture of lowering it. His mouth was open, frozen on the vowel of the word he was shouting. The soldier with the nervous twitch had his eye half closed. The dust his feet had kicked up was suspended in the air, tiny golden grains hovering motionless in the sunlight. The murmur of the crowd behind me hadn't just stopped. It had been cut off, like a rope. I could feel the silence. I could hear it. It was a low, deep hum, like the sound of a massive, distant machine. The panic vanished, replaced by a confusion so deep my brain ached. What was happening? Was I dead? Was this what happened afterward? No, I wasn't dead. I knew that because I still felt the ropes. They were still cutting into my wrists. The pressure on my chest was still there, making it hard to breathe. And I could feel the sun. The sun hadn't stopped. In fact, it seemed to have grown more intense. It was a physical, heavy heat that burned my skin, but it produced no sweat. It was a dry heat. And although everything was frozen, my eyes could move. I looked left, right. The guards, the commander, the grains of dust, everything was trapped like insects in amber. But I was conscious. I was terribly, painfully aware. It was then that a sensation began, not on my skin, but inside me. It started as a light tingling in the center of my chest, something like what you feel when you're about to sneeze, but 1,000 times stronger. It wasn't a physical sensation, but it was real. It was as if something was expanding inside me. I tried to move, to test the limits of this thing. I could breathe. I took a deep breath, and the air I breathed in felt different. It wasn't the dusty, stinking air of the courtyard. It was clean. It was cold. And when I let it out, no vapor came out, even though it felt like winter air. I looked at the soldier closest to me, the one with the twitch. He was so still he looked like a badly made statue. I could see the glint of sweat on his forehead, but the drop didn't run. The low hum I was hearing began to change. It didn't get louder, but it gained texture. It's the only word I can find. Before, it was a monotone sound, but now it seemed to have layers, like thousands of voices whispering at the same time, but so distant that no individual word could be discerned. It was a choir, but it wasn't music. It was just sound. And with it, the sensation in my chest grew. The tingling became a hot pressure, an energy that began to radiate outward, up my throat and down my arms to the tips of my bound fingers. Where the heat touched, the ropes no longer hurt. They were still tight. I could feel the physical pressure, but the sharp, cutting pain was gone. It was as if my nerves had been anesthetized by that energy. I looked down at my hands tied behind the post. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. They were hot, very hot, as if I had put them too close to a fire. A different fear hit me now. Not the fear of execution, but the fear of the inexplicable. What was happening to my body? What was this force that seemed to be filling me? Was I having a stroke? A heart attack? Was this how the brain died? Then I saw. Not with my eyes. Not exactly. It was a perception, an awareness that opened in my mind. The sunlight, which had been so blinding, began to look weak. Not that it had dimmed, but that another light had appeared. And this one made the sun pale in comparison. It didn't come from above. It didn't come from in front of me. It came from behind me. It came from within me. It was a light I couldn't see, but I could feel. It was as if my body had become a lamp, and someone had just flipped the switch. The light was white, unbelievably white, and it was pure. It had no heat like the sun. It didn't burn, but it was powerful. It was so dense, it seemed to have weight. I could feel this light pulsing in sync with the hum that now filled my ears, the choir of distant voices. The heat in my chest exploded, and I was sure I was on fire from the inside. But there was no pain. There was only fullness. I was no longer empty. I was no longer afraid. I was filled to the brim with this thing, this living light. The world around me, the frozen world, began to seem insignificant. The soldiers, the commander, the post, everything looked like a painted backdrop, false and two-dimensional. The only real thing was this presence that was flowing through me, using me as a channel. I could feel the light pouring out of me, illuminating the courtyard, even if no one else could see it. And in the midst of that light, I was not alone. I didn't see a figure. I didn't hear a specific voice. But I knew. I knew with a certainty that was deeper than anything I had ever learned in books or whispered sermons. I knew that He was there. The presence of Jesus wasn't something I was praying for. It was something that was happening to me. It was real. It was physical. And it was at that exact moment, in that dirty courtyard, while I was tied up to die, that I felt a peace that made no sense at all. It was a peace that was almost violent in its intensity. It pushed out all the fear, all the confusion, all the pain. I was tied to an execution post, with 6 rifles aimed at me, and I had never been so safe in my entire life. I don't know how long it lasted. Time no longer existed. I don't know if seconds or hours passed. The concept of time had dissolved. I was perfectly aware that my physical body was still there, pressed against the rough wood. I could feel the dead weight of my arms tied behind me, but it was a distant sensation, as if I were watching someone else's body. The excruciating pain from the ropes on my wrists had been replaced by a warm vibration, the same energy pulsing in my chest. It was as if the light filling me was actively pushing the pain out. I looked at the soldiers again. The world was still on pause. The scene was so bizarre that part of me wanted to laugh if I could have moved my face. The commander, with his open mouth and raised arm, looked like a ridiculous puppet. The rage on his frozen face seemed childish, impotent. The hum filling my ears, the choir of voices, seemed to have a location. It seemed to come from a point just behind my head, but also from within me. It was a closed circuit of sound and light, and I was at its center. I was no longer afraid of them. I was no longer afraid of anything. The feeling was one of total and absolute invulnerability. Not that the bullets couldn't hit me, but that they didn't matter. This presence, this light, wasn't just a good feeling. It was intelligence. It was an awareness. I didn't hear a voice telling me, "Do not fear," but I knew I didn't need to fear. I didn't see an angel, but I knew I was not alone. It was knowledge that was given to me instantly, implanted directly into my brain, bypassing my senses. And with this knowledge came an overwhelming perception of the world around me. I looked at the youngest soldier, the one with the nervous twitch. On his frozen face, I could see more than just the twitch. I saw his fear. I saw that he didn't want to be there. I saw the wife he had at home, the bread he ate that morning. I don't know how I knew. I just knew. It was as if the light filling me was showing me the inside of things. I looked at the commander and saw a hollow man, full of orders and bitterness. They weren't my executioners. They were just lost men, just as trapped as I was, but in a different way. And I felt no anger. I felt nothing but this deep peace and this powerful hum vibrating in every bone of my body. It was as if I had been tuned to a different frequency than the rest of the universe. I closed my eyes, not out of fear, but to concentrate better on this sensation. And that's when it intensified to an almost unbearable level. The light inside me, which was warm and peaceful, suddenly began to feel like love. Not the love we feel for a friend or family. It was a love of cosmic proportions. It was an ocean of pure and absolute acceptance. It was so dense and so real that I felt like I was drowning in it. It was a love that knew me. It knew about the hidden Bible. It knew about the secret meetings. It knew about my fear in the cell. It knew every bad thought I'd ever had. And it didn't care. It accepted me completely. And I wept. I couldn't move my facial muscles in the real world, but inside, my soul was sobbing with relief. It was the feeling of finally being found after a lifetime of being lost. I am here, the presence seemed to say, not in words, but as a fact. I always have been. I was tied up, about to be shot, and I had never, ever, in my entire life, felt so at home. It was the craziest and truest paradox I had ever experienced. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. It wasn't a gradual disappearance. It wasn't a fade-out. It was a cut. It was as if someone had pulled a master switch. The light, the hum, the presence, the overwhelming peace, the warmth, the feeling of home. It was all sucked out of me in less than a millisecond. It was a violent withdrawal, and the vacuum it left was horrifying. And the first thing that returned, in the deafening silence of that vacuum, was the pain, the physical pain. The ropes were razors on my wrists again. The post was hard wood against my back again. The air went back to stinking of dust and sweat. The sun was a hot hammer on my head again, and my knees, which had been steady, began to shake violently again. For an instant, I was back in my body, but the world was still frozen. I had a second of pure panic, a panic of abandonment. "No! Don't leave me now!" I screamed inside, and at the exact moment that thought formed, the sound returned. Time unlocked. The sound hit my ears like an explosion. The commander finished shouting his order, the word "fire" echoing across the courtyard. The murmur of the crowd returned instantly, an indistinct roar. The grains of dust fell to the ground. The soldier with the nervous twitch blinked. And, most terrifying of all, I heard the metallic sound of triggers being pulled. The 6 rifles aimed directly at my chest. I held my breath, my entire body tensed, bracing for the impact, for the tearing pain I knew was coming. This was the end. That moment of peace, whether it was real or a pre-death hallucination, was over. And now reality was here to claim me. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard I saw flashes of color. My jaw trembled uncontrollably. I waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Nothing. Just the horrible silence after the click of the triggers, the silence where the deafening roar of the shots should have been. I didn't understand. The order had been given. The triggers had been pulled. Where were the bullets? I opened my eyes slowly, afraid of what I would see. The 6 soldiers were still there, in the same position, rifles aimed at me, but their postures had changed. They were no longer tense and ready. They were confused. Their faces, which before were a mix of boredom, nervousness, and duty, were now masks of pure disbelief. The soldier with the twitch was staring at his gun as if it had betrayed him. He shook it slightly, as if trying to wake it up. The commander, who was expecting to hear the shots, took a step forward, his face turning red with anger. "I said fire!" he shouted again, his voice cracking at the end. He seemed genuinely perplexed. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry at his men, at the situation, at the inexplicable breakdown of procedure. The courtyard fell silent again, but this time it was a different silence. It wasn't the heavy supernatural silence from before. It was a human silence, filled with tension, embarrassment, and an electricity of "what the hell is going on?" The crowd behind me, which had been waiting for blood, was now murmuring with confusion. The commander marched to the nearest soldier, the one who had looked bored. He ripped the rifle from the man's hands, who let it go without resistance. The commander inspected the weapon furiously. He checked the chamber, the magazine, the firing mechanism. He seemed to be looking for an obvious flaw, something he could blame. I could see him fiddling with the bolt, his movements fast and angry. He aimed the rifle at the sky, away from me, and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Just the dry, dead sound of the firing pin hitting. Nothing. Or maybe hitting a bullet that refused to fire. He swore. A low, dirty word I didn't need to hear to understand. He threw the rifle back at the soldier's chest with such force that the man staggered backward. "Check your weapons, all of you, now!" he bellowed at the squad. The line of 6 men broke immediately. They no longer looked like a firing squad. They looked like a group of confused mechanics, each one looking at their own weapon as if it were an alien object they had never seen before. The sound of bolts being pulled and cartridges being ejected filled the air. I stood there, tied to the post, completely forgotten for a moment. They weren't looking at me anymore. I was irrelevant. The problem was the guns. I watched, my brain desperately trying to process what was happening. I had heard 6 trigger clicks. 6. The chance of 1 gun failing, maybe. 2. A strange miracle. But 6? 6 rifles, at the same time, failing to fire at the exact instant the order was given? It made no sense. My mind went back to the moment before. The light, the hum, the presence, the peace that had flooded me. Had it been real? Had that done this? Had that light I felt, the one no one else saw, somehow broken the machines? The idea was so crazy, I almost dismissed it. But as I watched those trained soldiers struggling with their weapons, unable to make them work, a chill ran down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with fear. It was a chill of dread, not the fear of dying. The fear of being in the presence of something so powerful it could simply say no to the laws of physics. The chaos among the soldiers lasted for what felt like an eternity. Brass cartridges fell tinkling into the dust. I saw one soldier, the oldest of the group, slamming the butt of his rifle on the ground in frustration, as if trying to dislodge some evil spirit from within it. The commander was livid. His rage was so palpable it felt like another source of heat in the courtyard. He went from man to man, inspecting each weapon, and in each one he found the same thing. Nothing. The guns were loaded. The ammunition looked perfect. The mechanisms were clean. But they would not fire. It was an impossible fact that was happening right in front of him. I could see the vein in his forehead pulsing violently. He grabbed a second rifle from another soldier, checked it with his own hands, and then, in a fit of blind rage, he turned and aimed it at me again. He didn't give an order. He pulled the trigger himself. Click! The sound echoed across the silent courtyard. Click, click, click. He pulled the trigger repeatedly, the dry sound of metal on metal. And I stood there, alive. I didn't even blink. That dread, that chill, had paralyzed me. I was no longer afraid of the bullet. I was afraid of the power that was stopping it. It was then that the commander stopped. He lowered the rifle slowly. All the air seemed to go out of him. The anger on his face didn't disappear, but it was buried by something much deeper, something I recognized because I had felt it myself. Absolute confusion. He looked at the rifle in his hands, and then he looked at me, and his gaze changed. It was no longer the empty look of an executioner, nor the anger of a frustrated officer. It was something else. It was a look of suspicion, but not suspicion that I had an accomplice, or that the guns had been sabotaged. It was a darker, more primitive suspicion. His eyes narrowed, and he examined me, not as a prisoner, but as if I were some kind of trick, as if I were an illusion. He looked at the crowd behind me, which was now completely silent, and then back at me. He was being humiliated. His authority, his power, his rifles, all of it had been rendered useless in front of everyone, and I was the center of it. He couldn't kill me. And worse, he didn't understand why. His face, once red with rage, began to turn pale. He took a step back, away from me, as if I were diseased. He looked at his men, who were still uselessly fiddling with their weapons. He opened his mouth to shout again, but hesitated. He couldn't give the order to fire, because he knew it wouldn't work. He couldn't leave me there. The entire situation had fallen apart. Finally, he made a decision. He didn't look at me when he shouted. He looked at the guards who had originally brought me, the ones standing near the gate. "Get him out of here!" he bellowed. The order was so abrupt, so different from what everyone expected, that for a second no one moved. "Now!" he roared, and his voice cracked, full of a rage that was actually panic. The soldiers of the firing squad backed away, lowering their useless weapons, their faces a mix of relief and a new kind of fear. They were looking at me now, not as a man, but as a sign, an omen. The crowd behind me began to murmur, but the tone was different. It was no longer the bloodthirsty anticipation. It was a buzz of astonishment. I could hear stray words, but I couldn't understand them. The two guards who brought me approached, and I felt the difference in them immediately. When they tied me up, they were brutal, efficient, their hands steady. Now, their hands were shaking. The man who went to untie the main knot at my waist had fingers that were trembling so badly he could barely undo the loop. He was avoiding touching my skin. He yanked the rope with a jerk, not out of cruelty, but out of haste, wanting to get the job done. The other, untying my wrists, released the rope so fast the abrasion burned my skin as it came off. They grabbed me by the arms, but the touch was different. It was a touch of fear. They wouldn't look me in the eye. They pulled me away from the post, my legs weak, and I almost fell. They dragged me across the courtyard, past the now scattered firing squad, past the commander who refused to look at me, his face a mask of stone. The walk back to the cell should have been a walk of relief, but it wasn't. It was the most terrifying walk of my life. I had survived. But what, exactly, was I now? What had happened? And what would they do to me, now that the bullets didn't work? The walk back was worse than the walk there, 1,000 times worse. Before, I was being taken to my death, but I was a man. Now, I didn't know what I was. The guards holding me, one on each side, no longer pushed me with anger. They were pushing me away from them, as if I were covered in some horrible, contagious disease. Their hands were sweaty and slippery on my arm, and I could feel the tremor coming from them. They were afraid, an abject, superstitious fear. They weren't escorting me. They were transporting hazardous cargo. When we passed the main cell block, the silence was total. The other prisoners, who had once looked at me with pity, now retreated to the back of their dark cells. They moved away from the bars as I passed. I saw one man, a convicted murderer I had once seen, break another prisoner's arm over a piece of bread, make a sign of protection against the evil eye when he looked at me. I was no longer one of them. I was not a martyr. I was something they didn't understand. And what they didn't understand, they feared. I could hear my own breathing, a harsh, ragged sound, and the drag of my bare feet on the stone floor. When we reached my cell, the logistical nightmare began. The guard with the key, the same one who had dragged me out hours before, couldn't get the key into the lock. His hands were shaking so much that the key clinked uselessly against the metal. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was pathetic. The other guard, the one holding my right arm, let go of me and slapped the first one's hand. "Open the door, you idiot!" he hissed, but his own voice was high with panic. He ripped the key from the other's hand and, after 2 tries, managed to turn the lock. The sound of the grinding metal sounded like a scream. They didn't put me back in the cell. They opened the door and threw me inside with all the strength they had. I tripped over the threshold and fell to my hands and knees on the dirty floor. the impact rattling my teeth. I hit my chin hard on the ground, and the taste of blood and dust filled my mouth. Before I could even turn around, the metal door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound of the bolt being thrown was immediate, fast, desperate. It wasn't the routine sound of locking up a prisoner. It was the sound of sealing a tomb to keep what was inside. I lay there on the floor for I don't know how long, spitting out a bit of blood and dirt. I didn't move. I was listening. I could hear them outside the door. They didn't leave immediately. I heard them breathing, panting, as if they had run a marathon. I heard one of them mutter something in a local slang I barely understood, something about eyes and fire. Then, hurried steps, almost running, echoing down the corridor until they disappeared. And then, silence. A silence I had never heard in that place. It was an absolute silence. There were no patrols, no distant sounds from other cells. It was as if that entire corridor had been abandoned, evacuated. They had left me there, alone. I rolled onto my back, the cold, damp floor against my torn clothes. I stared at the dark ceiling. My entire body began to shake, a delayed reaction, a violent tremor that came from deep in my marrow. I wasn't cold. I was in shock. I held up my hand in the gloom. It was shaking uncontrollably. It was my hand. But what had happened? 6, I whispered to the ceiling. 6 guns. It wasn't a miracle. The word felt wrong, too small. It was a violation. Something had broken the rules of the world. Following hours were the longest of my life, longer than the night before the execution. The silence persisted. The sun moved, and a thin, dusty sliver of light traveled across the opposite wall of my cell, marking time. The afternoon mealtime came and went. No one appeared. No bowl of watery gruel was pushed through the slot at the bottom of the door. No mug of water. The guards' fear was so great, they didn't even dare approach enough to feed me. Panic began to set in, a different kind of panic. Before, I was going to die quickly. Now, were they going to let me starve and die of thirst? I dragged myself to the door and banged on it with my fist. "Water!" I shouted. The sound of my own voice was shockingly loud in the silence. No answer. I banged again, harder. "Water! Please!" Nothing. I kicked the door, the metal vibrating under my foot. I could have been shouting in a vacuum. Were they out there? Were they hearing me and ignoring me? Or had they really abandoned this entire wing? The realization hit me like a punch. I had survived the firing squad only to be left to rot, because I was now something they were too afraid to kill and too afraid to keep alive. Thirst was what began to break my mind. The fear and the supernatural shock were one thing, but thirst was a physical, relentless reality. My mouth was coated in a thick film, and my chin ached from where I'd hit it. The taste of dried blood and dust was all I had. I dragged myself to the darkest corner of the cell, where an occasional drip fell from the ceiling, but the floor was dry. The drip had stopped. It was as if the entire prison was holding its breath. I curled up there, hugging my knees, and tried to think. I tried to process what had happened in the courtyard. The light, the hum, time stopping. Had it been real? Or had my brain, oxygen-deprived from panic, invented it all? But the failure of the guns was real. The faces of the soldiers were real. The fear in the eyes of the guards who threw me in here was real. 6 rifles. 6. I repeated it to myself, like a mantra. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. Something had intervened. And the horrible irony was that this intervention hadn't freed me. It had made me a leper, a monster. I had traded a quick, clean death for a terrified isolation. I prayed, but the words felt hollow. I was no longer praying for deliverance. I was praying for understanding, and nothing came. Night fell. The sliver of light disappeared from the wall, and the darkness in the cell became total, oppressive. The silence was so heavy that my own ears began to ring, trying to fill the void. And it was in that silence that I heard it, a sound, A light dragging sound outside my door. It wasn't the sound of guard boots. It was something softer. I held my breath. My heart hammered, banging against my ribs. Who was there? The sound stopped right in front of my cell. I could hear someone breathing. A quick, shallow breath, almost a wheeze. They were trying not to make noise. "Who's there?" I whispered, and my voice came out hoarse and cracked. There was a long pause, so long I thought I had imagined it. Then, a whisper back, so quiet I could barely hear it. "It's me." I didn't recognize the voice. It was a trembling sound. "Me who?" I asked, crawling silently toward the door. "It doesn't matter," the whisper said. Did you do that?" The question hung in the darkness. "Do what? Stop the rifles? Stop time?" I did nothing. I was tied up, waiting for death. "I didn't do anything," I whispered back, pressing my face against the cold metal of the door. "I don't know what happened." Another long pause. I could hear the man on the other side swallow hard. "They're afraid," he said. "The commander. He's in his room. Drunk. He keeps shouting that the guns were sabotaged, but no one believes him. The man who tried to shoot you first, the young one, he deserted. He just dropped his rifle and ran. No one's seen him since." This information hit me hard. The fear wasn't just in the guards who locked me up. It was spreading. The event in the courtyard hadn't been forgotten. It was rotting the prison's morale from the inside. "They think you're a demon," the whisper continued, "or a sorcerer. They don't know what to do. They're afraid to kill you now, but they're also afraid to let you live." His voice was full of a dread that mirrored my own. He wasn't a friend. He was just someone scared enough to come check if the monster was still in its cage. "I need water," I said, my throat burning. "Please, I'm dying of thirst." The silence on the other side was an answer in itself. I could hear him hesitating, fighting his fear. I wondered who he was. A prisoner on cleaning duty? A low-ranking guard sent to spy? "I can't," he finally whispered. They said anyone who approaches this door will be shot. No questions asked." He said that, yet he was at my door. The fear of execution was less than the fear of disobeying the order, or perhaps less than his terrified curiosity. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I'm just a man." The silence stretched. I could hear him shifting. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a metal canteen being opened. A moment later, a thin trickle of water began to run through the food slot at the bottom of the door. It was a small, pathetic stream, and most of it was hitting the dirty floor. I threw myself on the ground, pressing my mouth against the slot, licking the water and grime from the metal and the stone floor. It tasted like rust, dust, and salvation. It was the best water I had ever tasted in my life. I drank greedily, like an animal, until the stream stopped. "That's all I can," the whisper said, and then I heard his footsteps moving away quickly, disappearing into the silence. I lay there on the dark floor, wet with dirty water, shaking. I was no longer alone, but I was more scared than ever. That sip of dirty water changed something in me. It wasn't just the physical relief, though. That was overwhelming. It was the confirmation. The man on the other side, whoever he was as terrified as I was. And yet, he came. He had risked his life not out of friendship, but because of the event. What happened in the courtyard was real. So real that it had broken the prison's discipline, made a soldier desert, and forced a stranger to give me water, even under threat of death. I wasn't a demon. I wasn't a sorcerer. I was just the place where the lightning had struck. I sat up against the wall, the dampness from the spilled water cooling my leg. The tremor in my body finally subsided, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it felt like my bones were made of lead. I didn't try to pray anymore. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I just remembered. I closed my eyes and tried to force my mind back to those seconds or hours in the courtyard. I tried to recapture the feeling of the light, the sound of the choir of voices, the peace that was as heavy as a blanket, but I couldn't. It was like trying to remember a dream moments after waking. I could remember the facts, time stopping, the peace, the guns failing, but the feeling itself was gone, sucked back to wherever it had come from. The next 2 days were a torture of silence and anticipation. The same whisper returned the following night, at the same hour. More dirty water through the slot. This time, he also pushed through a piece of dry, hard bread. "They still don't know what to do," he whispered. "The commander was summoned to the capital. They're furious with him, but no one wants to take command. No one wants to be responsible for you." I said nothing. I just ate the bread, gnawing on it slowly to make it last, the taste of mold and wheat filling my mouth. I was an administrative anomaly, a supernatural problem, an error in the system that no one knew how to fix. I realized my fate was no longer in the hands of a judge or a commander. It was in the hands of frightened men in distant rooms, men who were looking at a report that couldn't be real, but was. I was no longer a prisoner to be executed. I was evidence of something they couldn't admit existed. On the third morning after the event, something changed. The silence was broken. I heard boots, many of them, coming down the corridor. But they weren't the hurried, frightened boots of the local guards. They were heavy, rhythmic, measured footsteps. Footsteps of men who were not afraid. My heart froze. I dragged myself to the farthest corner of the cell, shrinking back as much as I could. That sound was worse than the silence. The silence, I knew. This was new. This was authority. This was purpose. The footsteps stopped in front of my door. I heard no whispers, no nervous clinking of keys. I heard a short metallic sound, and then my cell door was opened in a single, smooth, powerful motion. The light from the corridor flooded the darkness, and I had to raise a hand to shield my eyes. They weren't the prison guards. They were soldiers. Different uniforms, cleaner, darker. And they weren't looking at me with fear. They were looking at me with a cold, calculating interest. There were 2 of them, and behind them, in the corridor, a man in a suit. A suit. In this place. It was so wrong, so out of place, that my brain stopped. The man in the suit stepped forward. He was older, with graying hair and eyes that looked like they had seen everything. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a professor or a bureaucrat. He looked at me, huddled on the dirty floor, and his face showed nothing. No pity, no anger, no fear. Just curiosity. "Get up," he said. His voice was calm, polite. It wasn't a shout. It was an instruction. I hesitated, my limbs stiff. The 2 soldiers took a step forward simultaneously, and I got up as fast as I could, bracing myself against the wall. I was filthy, stinking, barely able to stand. The man in the suit watched me for a long moment, like a scientist looking at a specimen. "What happened in the courtyard?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation, it was a genuine question. He wanted to know. I looked at him, my throat dry, even with the water from the night before. "I don't know," I whispered. "They tried to shoot me. The guns wouldn't." The man raised a hand, a small gesture that silenced me instantly. "We know what the guns didn't do," he said, with a hint of impatience. "I want to know what you felt." I looked into his eyes, those calm, analytical eyes, and I knew I couldn't lie. But I also knew the truth was impossible. How could I describe it? How could I put into words a sensation that was beyond them? I began, my voice hoarse from disuse and fear. "I don't know." I prayed. The man in the suit gave an almost imperceptible smile, a twitch of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Many men pray before they die," he said softly. "Their guns work." He took a step closer, and I fought the urge to flatten myself against the wall. He wasn't threatening me physically. It was his calm, his certainty, that was terrifying. "I am not asking about your faith. I am asking about the physics. What did you feel at the moment the rifles failed?" He wanted a report, data from a miracle. The absurdity of the situation would have made me laugh if I weren't so terrified. I felt warmth, I finally said, and a hum, a sound, like voices, but they weren't voices. And it stopped. Everything stopped for a second. The man in the suit nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed something he already suspected. It froze, he said. It wasn't a question. Time. You felt time freeze. I just stared at him, my silence being the answer. Horror flooded me. He knew. He wasn't guessing. The superstitious guards feared a demon. This man, this bureaucrat, was investigating a break in reality. I realized, in that cold moment, that I had escaped the firing squad only to fall into something much, much worse. I was no longer a religious prisoner. I was an experiment. I was the anomaly. "Where are the guards?" I whispered. A stupid question, but the only one my brain could form. "They have been reassigned," the man in the suit said, dismissing the question. "They are no longer needed. Their commander is being questioned for equipment failure and insubordination." He looked at me, and his face was empty of any human emotion. "You won't be needing them anymore. You are coming with us." "Us?" I asked, and fear made my voice go up an octave. The man in the suit didn't answer. He simply gave a short nod to the soldiers behind him. They moved as one, with an efficiency that wasn't human. There was no brutality, no anger, like with the prison guards. It was fast, precise, indifferent. One of them grabbed my arms and I had no strength to resist. The other moved behind me. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. That event in the courtyard, the light, the presence, had emptied me of all will. I felt a rough cloth being pulled over my head, a hood, a black bag that smelled of industrial oil and dry canvas. The darkness was instantaneous and total. My senses were cut off. I could hear my own breathing, very loud, inside the cloth. Then I felt a needle, a sharp, cold sting in my neck. I hadn't even felt the soldier approach. I tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the hood, and my limbs were already growing heavy, my thoughts dissolving. I was lifted off the floor. I was floating. My feet no longer touched the cell floor. I was being carried, but I didn't know by whom. The last thing I felt was movement, being taken out of that place, out of that silence, into a new kind of nothing. I don't know what happened. I don't know where I am. I survived my execution. I survived the rifles that wouldn't fire. But I don't know if I'm alive. I am somewhere dark. The light that saved me was the thing that condemned me. It marked me. It made me interesting. And to this day, I cannot explain what happened in that courtyard. I only know that death would have been kinder. What you have just heard defies everything we know. Where does reality end and divine intervention begin? Was he saved by God? Or marked by something we don't even understand? Leave your opinion here in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something that logic can't explain? Share your experience with us. If real and impactful stories like this make sense to you, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. It's the only way to ensure you won't miss the next transformative accounts. Don't leave now. The recommended video appearing on your screen was chosen for you. Click on it. See you next time.